Hello, and welcome to Varn Blog. Today I'm talking about class, which has finally been talked about on the American left since about 2008, and yet rarely gets talked about in a substantive sense. Even categories like PMC or elite get thrown around without the relative caveats that they need to be meaningful. But there's a bunch of tendencies we have to disaggregate here. Like, why is it that people have a hard time talking about the sociological reality of class versus the structural reality of class versus the identities and habitus, our habits and social world attached to class? Followers of Pierre Bourdieu tend to focus on habitus and sectional division. Followers of Weber tend to focus on opportunity capture, credentialing, and relative status. Followers of Marx tend to focus on roles in production, even more than income, and the power related to those roles. When people talk about them in general society, liberals will often use varying definitions. So everything I've read that defines working class defines it as not having a degree, even when working with people with degrees in the same job in the same position. So the liberal analysis will treat blue collar work as blue collar people without a degree. And the reason why is they're combining two things. They're combining role of production and also opportunity capture. So while a person in a working class job who has a degree is basically the same thing as a blue collar person who doesn't, as long as they have the same job, there is a sense that this person with a degree does have at least a 48% chance statistically, and I'm not making that up, to eventually get out of that position and work up into lower level management or something like that. Whereas the person without the degree is going to have to get the degree and take those costs on later in life. And it might just be an associate's degree a lot of times, but you see it, to be able to work up within their field or get additional certifications or get additional credentialing, even if it's not a university degree. The formalization of work also led to more choke points in credentialing capture. And leftists, by and large, don't want to deal with this, or if they do, they deal with it in the broadest ways. They talk about the professional managerial class and define it in all kinds of different ways. And they kind of depend on people not spelling that out. But there's also people who don't do that and will still talk about the working class, but they will talk about the working class only for itself, which means the sociological reality of working class people now doesn't have to be dealt with, and you don't have to criticize it. You don't have to demand anyone change. The conditions of labor that the Second International and Marx were actually looking at were different than the conditions now. We've seen the centralization of capital and the centralization of labor technology, but what we've actually seen is people being increasingly diffuse, particularly during deindustrialization. And I've had to break this down. There's three forms of deindustrialization, and we have experienced two of them. One is a mild decline of the proportion of GDP that comes from industrial development. Still mostly in industrial development, but it's declined as a percentage. Then you have to deal with workers employed in factories as a percentage of population, which has never been more than 50% of the population. In fact, that was a crisis for Marxism in the beginning of the 20th century. The entire revisionist controversy between Bernstein and Kautsky in Germany was about the fact that they had assumed that the industrial proletariat, and specifically the industrial proletariat, not just the proletariat in general, would make up more than 50% of the population. And the reason why the focus on the industrial proletariat was so important wasn't because that's what Marx said the proletariat was, or it was the only thing productive to capital by making physical widgets. By the way, that's Marx didn't even think that. His examples of people productive to capital as working classes were clowns and teachers, as well as, people in a factory. And his example talks about clowns generating surplus profit and teachers generating surplus profit when they work for a private school that is not tied into the state. Whereas when they do the same job for the state, they subsist off tax revenues. They're not generating the profits, even though they might be socially necessary. Okay, fine. That's Marx's distinction. We can accept that or not. Most people misunderstand it and misrepresent it, and I just wanted to clear that up for you. My point is that there's a whole sociological landscape that is much more general than this working class and middle class. The urban working class, the suburban working class, and the rural working class have different habits. There are different habits in different regions, also based on different sectors of the economy. What helps the auto industry might destroy another industry downstream of it. Are another example. Truckers unions have always been slightly more conservative and less interested in social labor because, well, logistics work, particularly in trucking in specific, is a relatively solitary act. Now, when I mentioned that technology has made this more diffuse, this is also true for things like electricians and steel workers and welders. People who used to work together in factories as part of a coordinated team now work together, whether they're employed or as contractors. They don't really work together at all. They do individuated tasks and are often in competition with their teammates. This changes the likely incentives for people to act in a certain way. And then you have to deal with the culture and habitats of which they live. There's a lot of pathologies of working class life that aren't just based on lumpenism that leftists do not want to talk about and do not want to deal with. And many working class people become conservative because they do want you to talk about them and they do want you to help them deal with them. And conservatives do talk about them, even if the answers they give, and this is not just the current round, are often total bullshit. But what are the leftists and liberals giving these people? A whole lot of nothing. But even when we talk about these categories, if I said you had to be somewhat nominalistic, like it's not that income driven categories, as reported to us by liberals in the media, are not real. They are real in the sense that once that category has a clear definition, we can talk about a clear thing. People who make between $80,000 and $120,000 tend to do this in this region. We know this sociologically. These are what we call aggregate facts. There's no for itself in the aggregate. It's just a description of reality parsed by some lens that you have clearly defined. Middle class is vague because it's always been broad, and it means different things in Europe than it does in America, and it means different things in America at different times. It's a relative term. Working class in Marxism is not a relative term, it is about a specific role in production. Do you generate surplus? Not just do you generate physical commodities, do you generate surplus for someone who owns the results of your labor? If it was just about physically generating commodities, then the petite bourgeoisie and the contractor, etc., would be the same kind of person, but they're not. Now, they're going to be strong overlap there and strong hostilities because their interests are different structurally. But to understand that, you really do have to dig into the sociological reality. If you want something to become a for itself, I mean, arguably the bourgeoisie in the United States is so degraded that it isn't even for itself. There's so much sectional competition between capitalists, regional capitalists, and finance capital versus productive capital versus on the front end or on the back end, productive capital versus extraction versus finishing. These are all different sectors of the economy. Some of them you can use government statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to figure out, and so much that it's still funded anyway. Some of it you can't. So we have to think about these aggregates as telling us a lot about large groups of people and their pathologies and cultural habits, and we should not shy away from calling pathologies. The romanticization of classes is like the romanticization of race. It does so in a way to like remove you from dealing with the effects that you have. If you romanticize the metist, which is the cunning in an Aristotelian sense, of say a marginalized group, You also make it, well, in a way you're saying we don't really have to change things for them because they already are empowered in their own ways. Standpoint epistemology does this a lot. I would love to claim that it has no relationship to Marxism, but it does. But even if we threw Marxism out, we have to deal with this, all right? I get a lot of people who think I'm just a Democrat or I just oppose Trump because they see the world through their affiliations, because their affiliations are voluntary. People think it says something about them. It is their assertion of individuality. And if you ignore that, you're gonna have a problem. Workers often do not want to congregate as workers, because to be a worker in the United States is to accept certain social statuses about yourself, and then there's a bunch of resentment and and stuff that emerges from that. Furthermore, we have to deal with interclass competition between people who could easily fall into the class just beneath them. There's a reason why, for example, there's a porous line between what Marxists call the lumpen, or the people who are not only informally employed. I don't actually consider just being informally employed lumpen, by the way. You can be in, like, most of the working class in the 19th century was informally employed, believe it or not. But who go in and out of things that would be criminalized, or are various forms of rent seeking outside of labor, etc. Just like there's people in the upper strata of the workers who have 401ks or professional degrees and habits, who also have connections to the bourgeois world in a real sense. And in fact, in some ways, 58% of Americans, period, and probably about half of salaried workers have a relationship to the bourgeois because they're tied into the stock market, even if that's just in their savings, even if they're private workers who just have IRAs and not even a 401k. Structural capitalization needs to be dealt with. So we have the aggregate, all right? We have the individual as a product. I cannot deduce from the aggregate what the individual is going to do. I can say what the incentives are in large scale in certain conditions about what is most likely. But I should not psychologicalize that to the point that I try to predict the exact actions of an individual in this way, because I will often be wrong. And I've made big mistakes about this myself. So then how do you handle that? Well, I've talked about, it's important to think about the aggregate as you know, in itself, just a descriptor of the most likely events of large groups and large numbers. And when you go to individuals, all that's going to tell you is probabilities, but there's a certain amount of contingency there. Like, an individual can identify with other classes, they have all kinds of incentives personally, and they have their own will. Whether it's free or not is a debate we can have endlessly forever. And I don't really care about that one way or the other. That's what you have to look at. So then we ask ourselves another question, and we really kind of think about this question for a second. Well, then what is it for itself? And I've talked about the collective, but I've really had to refine that, because there are collectives that are organizations that have an imaginary view, but they formalize that conception of themselves in some kind of program or charter or platform or whatever, whether you're a union or a think tank or however, you're going to have bylaws and a board and this, that, and the other, even if you're all working class. That is a kind of collective agency. It is a group that, through formalization, can act as a collective agent, meaning that because there is a corporate identity, and by that I mean added together, not corporation, although a corporation is a form of this, of this thing, say Teamsters Union 201, or Teachers Association of Kalamazoo, Michigan, or the IWW local local in New York City. There's formalization there that allows for deliberative processes, either by collectives or individuals, to act as an agent. That is one form of collective. That's a formal collective. That is formally for itself too. Political parties are a kind of collective like this, but we'll get back to that in a minute. But then there's another kind of collective, which we can call the collective as an imaginary, how we view the working class. A lot of, for example, socialists, on one hand, want free college and all this. And I'm not even saying that would be necessarily bad, but their view of what society should be is basically a white collar professional view that has some bourgeois characteristics, because white collar professionals have increasingly moved from petite bourgeois, people who formerly own their own means of production, into salaried labor working for larger groups, which means that they are what is often called in Marxist circles proletarianized, are made disciplined by the wage relationship. Now, there's still a very vast difference in power, though, both culturally and internally, between, say, a white collar worker and a blue collar worker. That's real. From the Marxist perspective, they're both either productive or not productive to capital, depending on whether or not they help some entity in the private sector make a profit. All right. Now, again, you can say, well, I don't care about the Marxist perspective. Well, you can say, well, some of these people are in the same strata of society and income. So there are plumbers that make $80,000 a year, and there are, say, teachers that make $70,000 a year. Like, we don't think of those as the same class, but in the liberal conception, they are, because they're within a standard deviation of each other in income. But they have vastly different cultural habitats, vastly different means of credentialing and curtailing and opportunity capture. Yes, Virginia, licensure means, though, that a lot of these blue collar workers do have opportunity capture. Electricians and plumbers can't be competed with just anyone. It's just not as hard as a teacher because there's less credentialing involved. But there is credentialing, and there is other blocks to entrance into the field. So we have to look at these sectional differences. Often things that seem irrational from the point of view of the whole class are very rational from the point of view of a sector or of a union or of a collective agent. Now, we don't like looking at these things this sensuously. And I do mean this sensuously. Like, when you're talking about the bourgeoisie, what do rentiers at a certain category eat? What are people doing who work in the tech field in LA versus Utah versus New York? And I mention that because I know people in other fields, and there are differences. There are incentives and material interest differences that you have to parse to understand this. So when we just talk about the broad working class, and you're not talking about it being already organized in any formal way and having some collective agent of which the individuals participate, it is not that you subsume your entire identity to the collective any more than an individual doesn't have collective identity and prior people informing them. I mean, you think in language, your language is not something you came up with, or it wouldn't be a language. It would be gobbledygook. Right? Symbolic reputation is actually dependent on a group of people interacting. The formal word for this is intersubjective, and I would say that is intersubjective between some collective imaginary, some imagined kinship group like kin, actually, or race or whatever, or some other imaginary, like the way you think class works. But to really get into what happens, why certain attitudes emerge, why certain classes of people do this, like, what do we do with the point, the literally an eighth of blue collar men who cannot regularly work because they're injured, who do not regularly have and I'm actually specifically saying this because we have an unemployment rate of like 4%. But even though we, like, that doesn't really add up when you think about the number of people not working versus the number of people working. All right, now some of this you have to take out children and whatnot, but even in this country, I think there's 180 million to 200 million workers out of 340 million people. and we only have an unemployment rate of 4%, which tells you the unemployment rate is not everyone who's not working. The unemployment rate is quite low. In fact, of people who like, if you were to look at this out of 340 million in that unemployment rate on average of 4% or 5%, you'd assume it's between 8 and 10 million people who don't work. But again, that can't be the case because, as we mentioned, between retirees and children and stay at home spouses and people who are disabled, it's actually more like 120 to 140 million, not just the 5 to 10 that you would see if we were just counting the average unemployed for the past decade and a half. So you have to like parse this out and think about what this implies and what this says. So there's like 1/8 of blue collar men who are injured who do not have regular work. Some of them do have work, some of them don't. Some of them are on disability, who often also do not have families and they don't even report having that many friends. And then you talk about work as not social anymore. Office work is probably more social than electrical work for people who've done it. Now, there still are social blue collar fields. Carpenters, particularly large scale carpenters, don't work by themselves. Um, but this idea of like the factory worker, automation has made the large skills, but small things that factory work used to require are a lot less necessary. A lot of factory working jobs is just, sitting in a what would we would consider sweatshop condition, stitching stuff because it's still hard to have machines do that precisely, although they can do it. Or you have stuff like people soldering in small screws in the iPhones, which is something that requires too much fine motor skills for a robot to easily do. At least that cheap. Like, you can make a robot that does have those fine motor skills, but it would be too expensive to mass produce. So when you're talking about this, you have to deal with that too. And you have to deal with the pathologies that show up in a group. Like, I've talked about this before. I got pushback for saying the blue collar working class was drug addled, and they're like, "Oh, you're shaming them." No, I'm not. Most of America is drug addled, but how they are drug addled and what resources they have to get out of it is vastly different. A middle class person is probably more likely to survive it than a nouveau riche person or a poor person. A nouveau riche person has enough money to really do some physical damage to themselves, and the poor person doesn't have the resources to get the help. And that's only going to get worse the way things are currently going. So, as we kind of parse this out, you can see why we need to get past the pure abstractions here. We don't need to be like, my form of class is real. Well, your form of class probably is real if you have a coherent and non contradictory definition. But you're talking about something else and someone who may be using the same words. Doesn't mean what they're saying is invalid or structurally unreal. Anything can be real if its definition has some correspondence to reality and doesn't self contradict. And if you're like, oh, but models are never the real thing, of course they're not. If they were the real thing, every word you say would be in literal utterance of reality and would destroy the reality. It would be useless to speak then. So this seems like a fine to philosophical thing, but it's something you have to think about. Which leads me to another thing I see. A lot of people, there's focus on race. And I think I have a lot of theories for why this is. One, America has an ugly racial history. But two, if you're a white middle class person, guess what you're never going to be? There's no way you're falling down and becoming black. Even if race is a social construct, it's constructed in ways that are relatively hard to change. There are people who, we might call the off-white hordes, or like Latin people who have where the constructions are more variable and they can move up and down based on status, because the correlates to them are more changeable. Which is also why race is an incoherent category, but nonetheless. But I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and be a black person unless I was already a mixed race person who could pass. Well, this makes it easy to like both valorize something, but also not feel intimidated by falling into it. And it also is easy to present that person because they're somewhat totally other than you in a way that flattens out their experience and doesn't deal with the gradation and presents them either as totally, reprobate racism or totally angelic, which is also kind of racist, but you see a lot of it. But with class, it's a little bit more difficult. Just like the blue collar worker often hates the lumpen, although is often lumpen themselves when there's an economic downturn, and knows those pathologies because drinking and drug use and whatnot are pretty common in both. We have to be honest that that's also kind of competition between people who just don't want to fall down. So the middle tier professional, the quote PMC, is often going to talk a good game about the working class, but also treat them like shit because they don't want to be them. And I see this all the time. I hear about solidarity between teachers, but then teachers say shit, well, they're treating us just like we're a 7-Eleven employee. And I'm like, well, why are you shaming the 7-Eleven employee? But also, you shouldn't romanticize them either. All right? You can somehow walk this line. I mean, it's the same kind of problem when I talk about how when I critique Biden, liberals come and accuse me of being a crypto conservative, although they do it less these days. It was bigger during the Obama administration, admittedly. And when I say something about Trump, everyone's like, why don't you talk about Soros and Biden? I'm like, I don't talk about Soros because I think the oligarchs are all doing bullshit, whether they're liberal or conservative. And I did talk about Biden for 4 years. He's not in charge anymore. You don't condemn Democrat. No, I think I've literally said that it's one side of the oligarchy pointing out there's an oligarchy, and then some people like Bernie Sanders who fight it, but also tie people to this party without really dealing with the fact you'd have to gut it to reform it in a major way. And all these people use working class in a way that's variable to not have to deal with it. Just like people who try to like speak to working class by repeating every bigoted notion that people project upon the working class, as if the working class was all just Southern quasi lumpen who just hated everyone of color. That's not true. But it's also not true that there's no racism in the working class. There's those complete projections. They're false imaginary collectives. If you want things to ever move to the for itself category, you have to deal with the in itself category. If you want unions to come back, you have to deal with the problems of unions. If you want to deal with the problems of sectional limits, you have to deal with the fact that unions are sectionally organized legally and also traditionally. And that has had problems with, both specific needs in specific places, which is why stuff like autonomia and stuff emerged in Italy, but also like taking one sector of a very specific part of the working class, so say truckers, for example, and pretending either they are totally not part of the working class or that they are, and they have specific sectional differences and you have to deal with it. Similarly, auto workers. I mean, auto workers have a very weird set of incentive. They're an industry that's kind of dying, doesn't need a whole lot of labor anymore, and is sustained in the United States largely off tariffs, but also, and it's had structural limits to like organizing in the South, even when it starts to succeed these a lot of these auto union attempts to unionize, like say foreign auto workers who build stuff in the United States. Had failed partly because you don't deal with local conditions, and even when you do, local laws can change to keep you out. We saw this with the UAW and with some of the Teamster stuff and attempting to organize Amazon. And then there's the broad using small service sector increases in unions to pretend that the large union field is growing, and these sorts of things. These are all ways to mislead people about class, and they're dependent on treating class solely as an abstraction that you don't look at the real sociological sensuous reality for. And I think people appreciate when you don't blow smoke up their ass, so maybe you shouldn't do that. And American politics would make a lot more sense to a lot of people. Because a lot of people, both liberal and conservative, are acting in ways that are not in their self-interest, and people are like, oh, the white working class doesn't vote in its self-interest. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It votes in its perceived interest, or it votes to block people who views as having perceived hostility to them. Often more that, really. But we have to deal with the fact that this is going to vary greatly depending on where you are, what kind of work you are, and what you're doing, and other issues. And if we think about the various forms of the word class that we're using, different classifications, that's what that word means. We are looking at the relationships between groups of people in terms of status, income, production, etc. Those are all different things, and we have to parse them both separately and together to figure all this out. When people just throw this stuff as an abstraction, I think they're usually using you and hoping that you don't actually think it through. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and protect your peace.